Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 53, The HITCH-HIKE, Antiheroes.
Or the anti-hitchhike. Bad jokes aside, what are we talking about today, Jonathan?
We're talking about protagonists that do not always make the most likable decisions. So instead of having many heroic qualities, like bravery and selflessness and that kind of thing, we're talking about characters that are more driven by greed or selfishness and that kind of stuff. And how you can, have an entire film that revolves around a character that does not have a lot of redeeming qualities.
Right, because you have to remember, going back to story fundamentals, that the term protagonist just defines the character who drives the action. The person who maybe not even the story is centered on, but the person whose choices and decisions propel the plot forward.
Not the most morally defendable character.
Yeah, no. Typically not the most best character, unless maybe like it's the Wizard of Oz.
But often you start out with a character who is not very, morally defendable, and then they become that person that you would look up to, that you would imitate by the end.
And
not
sometimes
so in
they
this
don't,
case.
And that's your antihero.
Right.
That's your antihero. Yes. So,
and these are all over the place, and we're going to try and expose those a little bit more for you. And we've talked about plenty of them on the podcast. Anytime we say the word neo-noir, we're probably talking about an anti-hero.
Oh, yeah, almost guaranteed. Very popular these days, especially among TV shows. Anytime a show is about a criminal, it's going to be an anti-hero. Almost everybody in Game of Thrones is, in a way, an anti-hero. Like, nobody's in that to be heroic. Except maybe Jon Snow. Everyone's in it to claim the throne. So anyway, this is a very popular topic nowadays, but it's always had its appeal to some people, and today we're going to talk about its appeal and usage by the master of suspense himself, Alfred Hitchcock. And what movies by Alfred Hitchcock are we going to talk about today, Jonathan?
Yeah, so we start off in 1955 with To Catch a Thief, with Cary Grant and Grace Kelly, who we did not get to talk about last episode with our women episode, but Grace Kelly plays a big part in Hitchcock's canon, so we get to dive into that. And this is based on a book by the same name by David Dodge. And at the Oscars, it won Best Cinematography for a color film and was nominated for Best Set Design and Costume Design for color film. Because this is the time when we could break it up between color and black and white films, and it wasn't just color films that sometimes got a black and white release, like Logan or Mad Max.
Right. And so the next film we're going to talk about is The Trouble with Harry from 1955, which is based on The Trouble with Harry, a book by Jack Trevor Story. It's the only out-and-out Hitchcock comedy. Some others might be comedic in a weird way, but this is the only one that is definitely a comedy in the traditional sense of the comedy-tragedy dichotomy of stories.
And then we move on from there to 1958 and a film that is decidedly not comedic with Vertigo, based on a book called From Among the Dead by two French names that I'm not going to attempt. And this was nominated at the Oscars for Best Set Design and for Best Sound, but it did not win any, and was actually kind of just a mediocre release in terms of reception. Like it didn't flop or anything, but it didn't make a lot of money. And it's one of those that we've talked about a lot of times, slow burn, and it is currently on the BFI's Sight and Sound top 50 films of all time, and it is number one right now. And after 50 years, it beat Citizen Kane in 2012. And this is a poll of like film critics from all over the world. It's considered one of the most reliable kind of film ranking polls.
Yeah, it's maybe the best crafted of the Hitchcock movies. Certainly has a lot of appeal, especially to the art house crowd. It
fully encompasses like all the things we've been talking about that Hitchcock uses over and over again thematically and character-wise and all that, and just kind of pushes them all to 11, breaks some of those tropes, and then recreates them again. So we're going to get into a lot of that at the end of this episode.
Oh, yeah. It gets quite weird, too. That'll be fun to talk about. But before we get into the individual breakdowns, just a note on adaptations. Because as you noticed, if you just listened to the 3 films we described, all of them are based on books. And this is the 3rd week of the Hitchhike series, and almost all of them have been based on books and other stories. And I just wanted to make a note about this because it's something that stuck out to me, and it seems like an important comment to make. But Hitchcock is definitely a master visual storyteller. He's somebody who is very competent within, more than competent. He is like one of the genius gold standards of the filmmaking genre and the audio-visual way of telling a story that is film. But he's not a story originator. He's not a guy who can sit down and come up with a story on his own, as well as the best of the best in that category. And this brings me to another point that storytelling and story creating are separate but related talents, and sometimes we forget that, especially among a lot of us aspiring filmmakers who want to both create and then tell the stories that we will eventually make into films. But it can be just as impressive to just visually tell a story that somebody's come up with in an incredibly skillful way. Sometimes the person sitting around the campfire telling a story in a very entertaining fashion is not the same person who came up with it. And the fact that those two talents are different isn't a bad thing. It's a very collaborative art. And I don't say this because I think a lot of people have that misconception. Maybe it's just dispelling my own misconception about this. But I almost feel like whenever we have to read off that a movie is based on something else, it lessens it in some way. And part of that might have to do with the fact that nowadays there are so many adaptations that are done just for the sake of a studio having a safe property that has a pre-established audience that they can trade off of. And so we feel like adaptations might be slightly cheaper than an original story. But it's not always the case, and it certainly hasn't always been the case. And whether I'm dispelling your disbeliefs or my own pre-misconceptions, then let them be dispelled about storytellers and story creators.
Yeah, and you have to remember that a lot of these, the Quentin Tarantinos and Christopher Nolan types who do, for the most part, write and direct their own material is fairly new phenomenon. I mean, they're not the only ones throughout history, but for a long time at the beginning of cinema, it was a lot of buying the rights to books and stage plays in order to put them on the screen. And there's some adaptation involved with that. But, that was the standard for a really long time, like throughout the golden age of Hollywood, was to just buy existing intellectual property and put it on film. So, I don't think there's anything that diminishes it. It's an interesting conversation, and we're going to have that conversation, especially with Vertigo, about things that the way that Alfred Hitchcock decided to take the plot of the story and reveal it in the film and change it in a way to make it more compelling on film. So, yeah, that's definitely an interesting thing that, it's almost like a privilege these days to be able to write and direct your own material, but that's not always the case. And that's why screenwriters have a job.
Right. And we're glad they do, because sometimes the people who are best at writing are not the best at directing.
And vice versa. So they need each other. All right. So, Jonathan, do you want to take us into our first film of the day, To Catch a Thief from 1955? Yes, and I just want to kind of start out this whole episode that there's a lot of spoilers in these movies, so definitely go watch these before we talk about them, because it's a lot of fun to just experience Hitchcock unveiling the story and not listen to us drone on about them and spoil them all before you watch it. Anyway, To Catch a Thief starts with a series of burglaries of jewelry. And then we are introduced to Cary Grant's character, who we learn used to be a jewel thief before World War II. And then he ended up being getting involved in the war. And since then, he has not been stealing, which is what he tells the other characters around him. Although some of them don't believe him. Some of them are a little bit more inclined to believe him until. And the other part about all this is that basically these burglaries are being done in the same way that Cary Grant's character, John Roby, the cat, this is his little robbery nickname, they're being done in his fashion with his signature way that he steals jewelry or whatever. So everyone thinks that he's doing these, and he keeps telling people that, no, I'm not doing them. I'm not doing them. He ends up in a conversation with a jewelry insurer who obviously has a lot of interest in this string of jewelry robberies, because he's going to end up having to pay all these people back, which he does not want to do. So Cary Grant offers his services. Since this person is using all of his techniques, Cary Grant believes that he will be able to catch the real perpetrator because he can think like them.
Yeah, and just like the title of a movie.
Right. So there's a great moment where the jewelry insurer hands him a list of the people with the most valuable jewelry that are insured with him. And so then we have this moment of, okay, now Cary Grant has this information. He knows where all the most valuable jewels are, and we know that he used to be a jewel thief. So what's going to happen? And he ends up going to dinner with one of the families who has the most expensive jewels, which is a mother and daughter. So Grace Kelly and her mom are there, and they end up having Cary Grant and Grace Kelly end up falling in love through a series of circumstances. And she catches on that he is the cat, and she thinks that he's the one doing all of these robberies, and she's excited about that, and she wants in, and she wants to be part of it. And he keeps denying that he is John Robbie because he told them a different name and all that. So basically, to make this very long synopsis shorter, we go through them planning to catch the jewel thief at this ball, and we find out who it is, and it all gets wrapped up. But again, it's about the characters and the journey that we're on throughout this.
Right. So the lesson is kind of that to catch a thief, it takes a thief, or maybe that's just the kitschy plot title. But anyway, it definitely. So there's this interesting mix here, because Cary Grant is accused and chased by the police, which establishes him as a wrong man, but he doesn't 100% fall into the wrong man archetype that Hitchcock has already established in so much of his work, because most of, if not all of Hitchcock's wrong men are either average guys or completely innocent guys. He actually has a movie called Just the Wrong Man, which is borderline documentary, starring Henry Fonda. And that guy is so sympathetic. He is the pinnacle of Hitchcock's The Wrong Man as an archetype. Maybe not as a film, but as an archetype. He's completely sympathetic. Cary Grant is not that. Cary Grant kind of just wants to be left alone. He's kind of like an older retired thief who just wants to be left alone. He's very self-interested. Allegedly retired, right.
Because that's one of the main elements of this whole thing, is that the audience doesn't know if Cary Grant is actually doing these robberies or not. There are several instances where, Cary Grant has gotten on with this mother and daughter, and then we see he's awake, and then we see he's awake in a different position the next morning, and suddenly the jewels are gone. And so we're like, ooh, okay, so he's in a very good position to have stolen these. But did he do it? So that's the interesting part about this, is that he is a wrong man and an anti-hero at the same time, because for most of the film, we think he's an anti-hero until the real robber is unmasked, literally, and we find out that he was a wrong man to the audience. So there's a lot of layers in this.
Yeah. And just to define what makes him an anti-hero is that he's not even... I mean, yes, he's trying to get out of this wrong accusation, but it's not like he's innocent. He's kind of a retired
anti-hero.
Yeah, right. He's not doing anything wrong at the moment, but it's not like he's completely clean either. Like, he has a sordid past. He has, and you can tell in his character traits too throughout the film that he kind of fits this anti-hero archetype as he...
And he's not repentant about it. One of my favorite scenes in the movie...
he's not sorry at all.
Right. One of my favorite scenes in the movie is his conversation with the insurance agent, where he starts off by saying, like, the insurance agent is trying to give him the benefit of the doubt the whole time. And he's like, so, after you got involved in the war and we're trying to make up for things, you gave all the money back, right? He's like, nope, I kept it all for myself. I wanted the money, and so I kept it. And then he goes on to make this pretty compelling case for the insurance agent to be like being a thief just through little petty things like stealing stuff from a hotel room and stuff like that. He's like, oh no, that's not a big deal. He's like, but you are a thief, so you're just an amateur thief, but it'll help you to connect with us professionals. And that's one of the lines. And so in that scene, he's essentially turned this anti-hero idea onto the audience. So now the audience is implicated in anything that Cary Grant does because we are somewhere on the same ladder with him.
Yeah, you think about all those hotel pins you've taken over the years. Oh no, what will I ever do with this Holiday Inn pin? I guess I'm an anti-hero now.
And especially if you've pirated To Catch a Thief and you're watching it.
Oh gosh, that would be a meta level. That would be a meta level. Yeah, so he is definitely an anti-hero in the sense he's selfish, he's unrepentant, he's self-motivated, in a self-defensive manner and not a noble manner, not a heroic manner, even though he's the protagonist of the film who ends up actually doing a public good by the end of the movie by catching this thief.
And then he tries to run away and like hide his face like, oh man, I did a good thing.
Yeah.
But another interesting thing in this whole, character development is Grace Kelly's character. And the fact that she, first of all, pegs him as the notorious robber, and then is not like, hey, I'm going to report you to the police because I'm pretty sure that you're stealing all these jewels, but it's like, hey, let me help you case your next joint. This is fun. And
she's into bad guys. Oh yeah.
Yeah, and so she kind of becomes this anti-hero because regardless of whether or not he is stealing the jewels, she thinks he is and she likes it. So then she becomes we're like, oh wow, so she's just fine with thievery and
she's like the
felonies and stuff like that.
She's like the anti-heroine of the picture.
She's like a potential anti-hero because she doesn't really do anything, but she's okay with doing the wrong thing, which is a really interesting element.
Until the moment it affects her.
Yeah, when her mom's jewels get stolen.
When she thinks that Cary Grant has stolen her mother's jewels. And again, that's a very self-motivated reaction. Oh, it's okay to steal other people's stuff, but if you steal my stuff, oh no.
And she literally tells Cary Grant that. She's like, here, let's steal from this person and not mother because she really likes you and that would be a pity.
Yeah. And in a way, that is almost like a reflection on the audience because we're sitting there enjoying this story about cat burglars. We think that like all of this highfalutin jewel thievery is really entertaining and we love hearing about it. But oh my gosh, if that ever happened to us, we would blow our tops.
Right.
We would hate the jewel thief. We wouldn't find him entertaining at all.
Except for the mother, which just to throw in her into this whole mix.
Oh god, she's like, a character.
Right. So, I mean, we talked about, Grace Kelly is the blonde in this film and her mother is part of this. We talked about how mothers play into all this. She's kind of more on the fun side of mothers in Hitchcock films because she's kind of going for Cary Grant too. She gets all excited about him stealing stuff. She's like, oh, I don't really care about the jewels. They're insured, which of course isn't good for our insurance agent character. But she's just kind of along for the ride, and then she ends up covering for Cary Grant when he slips out the window. And so she is less upset about her jewels being stolen than her daughter is.
Yeah. Which we should talk about this. It all leads to a kind of a romp type mood. Like it.
Yeah, this whole film is much lighter.
Yeah, it's not a comedy. It's. I wouldn't say it's a comedy, although there are plenty of comedic moments. But
it's along the lines of North by Northwest.
Yeah, it's not nearly as intense as Vertigo.
If anything can be.
Which we'll get to. But it's not nearly as dark as Marnie or Vertigo or one of the movies that we're going to be or any of the movies really we're going to be talking about next week when we talk about Psychos. Which, oh boy, that's going to be intense. But nobody in this film is a psycho. They're all very self-motivated people. They're all in their own ways and to some degree an anti-hero. And I feel like them all kind of being self-motivated anti-heroes makes it fun to watch because you don't feel like anybody's really being victimized. If everybody is victimizing each other in this very lighthearted, rompy kind of way.
And Cary Grant brings that almost just naturally with his performances. And it's really interesting in the, and I'm going to come back to the Hitchcock Truffaut book because I got to, it's a big driving point of, basically any kind of Hitchcock study is that interview with Truffaut.
If you guys are wondering, Truffaut paid him to plug this.
Right. From the grave.
He didn't pay me, though. That's why you don't hear me talking about it.
I'm sponsored by Francois Truffaut himself. But they talk about like the way that Hitchcock uses Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart and Truffaut's like, you could almost think about them as interchangeable, but you use them to very different effect. And we talked about before how Jimmy Stewart was almost in North by Northwest and how different of a film that would have been. And it's kind of the same thing with To Catch a Thief. And we could talk about that again with Vertigo, because putting Jimmy Stewart in To Catch a Thief, like it would have been very similar, but there's definitely a different quality to Jimmy Stewart. It probably would have been a performance similar to the remake of the Man Who Knew Too Much in just the way that Jimmy Stewart portrayed it, but it's not quite as charming as what Cary Grant is able to bring to the table in films like this and North by Northwest.
Yeah. Because the idea of a film star in the 1950s, that late studio era, and even to some extent these days, but a film star wasn't nearly... They weren't chameleons in the way that a character actor would be. They would more or less play themselves. They built a brand in modern vernacular. Yeah, they had a brand. They had branding. Oh, gosh. Could you imagine if they had Instagram back then? But yeah, they built a brand, and they kind of were themselves to some extent in every role they played, much more than a supporting actor or a character actor would be. So that's why in every single Cary Grant movie, like, he doesn't disappear into a role. He's very much Cary Grant in every role that he is. Both Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart are very, very good examples of that. Actually, they don't change very much, and it's interesting to see them in different films that are have very different tones to them, because it's putting a different spin on their same old mannerisms. So the mannerisms of Cary Grant in To Catch a Thief come off very aloof, whereas in Bringing Up Baby, they come off as very zany and charming. The mannerisms...
And then to push it a little farther, like in a movie we haven't talked about yet, but probably will at some point, Charade, where you're really not sure how far along this criminal line he is. He's even a little darker than in To Catch a Thief. Yeah.
And the very idiosyncratic mannerisms and even just speech patterns of Jimmy Stewart are incredibly different in a film like It's a Wonderful Life, where they make him seem charming and disarming and almost bumbling in a way, even though he's a very smart character in that film. Whereas
and there's a lot of emotional range in that film too, but it's very different emotional range.
Yeah, it's just all put through this Jimmy Stewart filter, and those same mannerisms are present in all of his films. So those same mannerisms in something like Vertigo, which we're about to talk about here in a minute, or the Otto Preminger film The Anatomy of a Murder, are much different. They seem much more calculated, much more intent, and in a way much more sinister once we get to Vertigo, which is fascinating. But yeah, it's fascinating to see these different spins put on these different brands that stars had of the day, and the way that would affect a film like a Hitchcock film, who wasn't all about trying to change his actors into something they weren't. He clearly has an established pattern for working with. Well, I mean, I think by that I meant he very much liked working with the same people over and over, whether or not he liked it or just did it out of habit. But he did love working with Cary Grant.
Yeah. And I feel like part of that is a working relationship, of course. We've talked about that a lot. But also, Hitchcock is famously a director who has to see the film before it's made. So he has to be able to visualize every aspect of his film. And so I don't know how much it plays into it, but if it's an actor he's worked with before, it's probably easier for him to visualize them in the role. And if it's an actor he hasn't worked with before, there are lots of stories like with Tippi Hedren, we talked about with The Birds last week, of him basically transforming them into the character or the actress that basically he wanted in the role, like turning them into something that he wanted. And he talks about that a lot, especially with actresses. Yes, exactly. And we'll talk about that with Vertigo. But he talks about in his interview again, several actresses that he basically would have a plan. So he would hire them for a series of movies, and he would put them in roles and basically systematically create a persona for them for the audience to identify them with. So I think he even did that with Grace Kelly, and we're going to talk about her a little bit more in Rear Window, but giving her, progressively changing her character into what he wanted the audience to see her as, which is a really interesting kind of long-term plan for a director that you don't hear about a whole lot.
Yeah. That could be a big boost to a career too, if you think about it. Mm-hmm. A director taking you more or less under his wing, because I don't see Alfred Hitchcock as the nurturing type, but also wing, birds, pun. Anyway.
A little bit more in Alfred Hitchcock's case, like under his scalpel feels like a better illustration.
Right. And and as we've talked about before, it sounds like, and as we'll see with The Trouble with Harry, it sounds like Alfred Hitchcock has a very dark, very cruel sense of humor, delivered in a very dry British flat tone, which I think made him seem meaner than he was. From all intents and purposes, it sounds like half the things he said were meant to be jokes, but weren't taken as such. And of course, I've never met the man. I don't know. But that can be an intense personality to be around, as we've heard from different actors.
And kind of along those lines of Hitchcock's idea of female characters, again, is something that he describes in the way that he likes his women portrayed, which is a strange way of putting it, but he talks about in several different interviews the way that he likes the sexiness of a woman to be discovered. He didn't like actresses like Brigitte Bardot or Marilyn Monroe, who just kind of like flaunt their sexuality. Just kind of there's no surprise to it. You know what's there and you know what you're getting. But especially in this film, you can see with Cary Grant what he often describes as like the English woman sensibilities, where she's very cold and a little bit aloof in public, but in private is a very different matter. And there is a definite example of that in To Catch a Thief, where Cary Grant has met Grace Kelly at dinner, and we see her in profile, and she doesn't say very much. She's kind of just like eyeing him calculatingly and sizing him up and all that. And then he walks her to her room, and before he can even say anything, she kisses him just out of nowhere. So now you're like, whoa, where did that come from? So it's just kind of like it layers the character immediately, because it's like, okay, that's not who I thought she was, but now I see these different sides of her, which is a really interesting thing. And the other female character we haven't talked about yet is, referring back to our last episode, the dark-haired, in this case, redheaded rival character, who is a French girl in this film. But there becomes this rivalry between Cary Grant and Bridget Aubert, the actress. And spoilers, again, I already put that disclaimer out there, but she ends up being the jewel thief. So not only is she the rival to Grace Kelly, but she also ends up being the rival to Cary Grant, because she has worked with him closely before and now is pinning all of her robberies on him. So that is just another element to all of this.
Right. More characters acting selfishly, but not in like a super dislikable way, more like a super entertaining way that they keep acting selfishly, which is good. You want that in a film.
And we've hit all three of our Hitchcock female stereotypes again, so check that off the list.
Yeah. And as far as director signatures go, Alfred Hitchcock's are maybe some of the strongest out there. Maybe Wes Anderson is up there in terms of just being able to look like at one frame of or one detail of a story or one frame of a film and being able to know like, oh, that's a film by so and so. They both have very, very strong styles. A lot of Hitchcock filtered into Wes Anderson's work by the way.
And most prominent directors that you know their name were influenced by Hitchcock.
Yeah. In Wes Anderson's case, a lot of it gets filtered through like the French New Wave and Bogdanovich to Wes Anderson. And then probably the next generation of filmmakers will have Hitchcock influences both from Hitchcock that have been filtered from Hitchcock through the French New Wave, through Wes Anderson to them. Anyway, whoever has to do a podcast about film like 200 years from now is going to have a real hard time of it. Good luck with that.
I'm glad this is not an art history podcast. I'll just put it that way. Like painting.
Yeah, no, we're doing this at a good time. You know, there's a lot of film history out there to be covered and to dive into, and we're living at this interesting point in the history of the medium where everything's digitizing and there's the internet and anyone can do it in their backyard, but that doesn't mean anyone can really do it well. But we also don't have so much history of it that it's just all a wash, like art history, where you have to specialize in like a decade or like one group
style,
or like one group of people in like one country at one point in time. Like imagine if the only kind of film you could study would be French New Wave film. I don't care how much you like French New Wave film, you would go crazy only studying French New Wave film. So yeah, no, large canon, but manageable. Good time in film history. Anyway, moving on to The Trouble with Harry, but not so fast. Let's talk about color. And not just because I do that professionally, so that I can eat pizza and afford movie rentals for this podcast, but also because it's really fascinating. To Catch a Thief is a Technicolor film from maybe the golden era of Technicolor, or the start of it, from the 50s. This is
one of Hitchcock's most beautiful films to me. It is really gorgeously shot.
Yeah, no, that color cinematography film award is well deserved. It is gorgeous. And there's a lot of really prominent green throughout this entire film that is just fantastic, especially in the night shots, to kind of go with this cat theme. Cary Grant's going around in black across rooftops with green, kind of like the green eyes of a cat. Really beautiful. Of course, they're shooting along like the French coast of the Mediterranean. So all the landscapes are already gorgeous. And then you throw these big sand beaches in there and all this water and all this sky. And as you said, or as you mentioned to me, Jonathan, before we started, they did something to get the blues just right in this film.
Yeah, so there's a filter, because basically Hitchcock did not like a lot of the night scenes at this time period, just in general, were day for night. And we've talked about that a little bit before. But Hitchcock didn't like the way that the sky always turned out to be this very like royal blue and stuff like that. And it kind of gives it away. So he ended up putting a green filter onto the camera, which makes the ground and everything kind of seem more green, but it gets the sky darker by taking the greens out of the blue there. And Hitchcock said he wasn't totally happy with it, but it was closer. And I think it's really interesting because one of the things about Hollywood night scenes is that Hollywood basically invented the blue night idea, the idea that moonlight is blue when it's not, it's literally reflected daylight. So even though the sky is darker and it has a blue cast to it, the light that actually comes at night is just white. It's just normal light. So the fact that we kind of associate blue light with moonlight is totally fabricated. And, why not make it green? And like you said, it has thematic implications in this film. And it's just really interesting and really it's kind of like a signature of this film. Like when I think of this film, I think of that, green rim light and just really dark shadows for the night scenes. It's unique amongst Hitchcock films and pretty much all other films.
Yeah, no, I love that. It is its own thing. There's something to be said for going with what always works, like a blue night, but there's also something to be said for going your own direction and making a bold, strong choice that is motivated in a certain direction that whether or not it works as best as the other choice would have makes the final product, the final story, the final film more unique and more memorable. I think that's what I'll probably remember most about this film as we get months and months farther away from me having watched it, will be the colors and the fireworks I saw and the sea I saw, and the greens across the rooftop that I saw that were just so striking and so different from everything else that they stuck in my head. And that's something admirable about a film, if you can get something stuck in your head about it. And of course, I would be amiss to not mention the cameo in the film. And we're going to start including time codes for you guys in case you really want to look them up. So at 9 minutes and 40 seconds, Cary Grant has just slipped away from the police by parking his car and slipping onto a little French bus. I didn't even recognize it as a bus. I thought it was like a VW van, until we cut to inside of it and it's a bus. And I guess French buses are tiny. Anyway, sitting next to Grant on the bus is Alfred Hitchcock, at 9 minutes and 40 seconds again, if you would like to look that up.
The other interesting thing about that is that on one side of Cary Grant, there is a woman with a bird in a cage, and on the other side is Alfred Hitchcock. Yeah. And this film is well before the birds came out. So I thought that was just kind of like a little providential scenic moment.
Well, you don't make a movie about birds, Jonathan, if you don't like birds.
That's true. I mean, well, the birds were the bad guys, so you have to feel strongly about birds one way or the other.
Yeah, but to Alfred Hitchcock, everyone was a bad guy.
That's true. Very true. Yeah. And speaking of everyone being a bad guy, let's talk about The Trouble with Harry from 1955.
The Trouble with Harry is that he's dead. The title of the film is just The Trouble with Harry, but the trouble with Harry turns out to be, that he is dead. He is a strange man in this small Vermont town. I don't actually remember if it is specifically Vermont, but it might as well be. It's got beautiful rolling hills and wonderful fall trees with their nice red and gold leaves, and a very small population. In fact, we only see 1 or 2 houses over the course of the entire film, and we only meet like 4 or 5 characters, definitely less than 10. And we open on this young boy with a water gun or a fake gun of some sort, some kind of toy gun, finding this dead body and running off to tell his mom. The dead body, as you have definitely figured out by now, is Harry. And everybody seems to think that they've killed Harry. The first person to think they've killed the body is Captain Wiles, who is out hunting rabbits, almost like a odd cartoon series that you might have heard of, and stumbles upon this dead body and is completely sure that he has shot this man
on accident.
On accident, and instead of doing anything else about it, he's like, oh, I should probably bury him. So he starts to pick him up when suddenly this little boy and his mother come up the hill. The little boy, who has already found the body and is showing his mom, so he hides in the bushes, and the woman goes away after telling her son not to worry about the body. And that woman
and she says things like, or he says, but mommy, will he wake up? And she's like, I hope not. And so let's go get some hot chocolate or something like that. She does not care at all, but she knows him.
We're already very deep into the dark humor going on. But anyway, that is Jennifer Rogers, played by Shirley MacLaine, who also thinks, as we find out over the course of the film, that she's killed the man who was her estranged husband. They go into the backstory. They weren't actually in love. He married her out of obligation after his brother, her deceased husband, passed away. But anyway, she thinks she's killed Harry by hitting him over the head with a milk bottle. So she's not very upset about him being dead and is perfectly fine with letting him rot on the hill. So after Jennifer Rogers leaves, the captain goes back to trying to bury the body. He picks it up by his feet. It's a very funny pose. Anyway, along comes Miss Gravely, an older woman of the town, and she notices the body and is just kind of having this pleasant conversation with the captain while the captain is standing there holding the dead man's legs, asking him how he's going. She doesn't seem overly shocked by this body, and that's because she also thinks she's killed the man. Apparently, after being hit on the head with the milk bottle by Mrs. Rogers, Harry was stumbling around the woods, and Miss Gravely thought he was attacking her. So she took off her old hiking boot and whacked him in the head with it, assuming that she killed him, now finding his body. And so that is the summation of all of the characters who have actually think they've killed Harry. Spoiler alert, none of them killed Harry. But we also have a couple other characters that we should introduce. One of them is Sam Marlowe, who is an artist who lives in the town and reminds me of no one so much as the artist in The Iron Giant, except a couple decades beforehand. Living in this small town, being an artist, he just makes very odd paintings, puts them in the local convenience store, and then no one ever buys them. Except there's this comedy routine that this rich guy in a limo stops by the convenience store, sees the paintings, and keeps trying to buy them. But Sam Marlowe's always too busy to notice him or pay attention to him, as he's busy with other things. Which other things are either digging up or burying this body. Yes, as we'll get into. And of course, there's also the doctor, who plays kind of a minor role, but he is reading a book, walking around the hills, and he will occasionally kind of walk by the body. There's once or twice that he just steps right over it without noticing it because he's so engrossed in his book. I think he trips over it once and apologizes to it, and then just moves on without even noticing. Of course, there is the deputy sheriff of the town, who's kind of like the antagonist in a way. He's like the only one without a sense of humor in the town. But it helps that he's a little bit bumbling at the same time. He's very kind of country. Oh yeah, he couldn't be competent or this movie couldn't work. Exactly. And of course there is the convenience store owner, who is a friend to the artist, and it kind of just acts as a place where some of the action takes place. A lot of this film feels like it would work very well as a stage play. Like there's like 4 settings, and you just kind of go back and forth. Anyway, over the course of the film, these characters all learn about the dead body, except for the sheriff. But our 4 main ones are the captain, who thinks he's killed Harry by shooting him, Mrs. Rogers, who thinks she's killed Harry by hitting him over the head with a milk bottle, and Miss Gravely, who thinks she's killed Harry by whacking him in the head with her hiking boot. And Sam Marlowe's just kind of along for the ride, partially because he's kind of friendly with the captain, and also partially because he's got a thing for Mrs. Rogers now that they've met. And of course, there's some romance storylines that happen over the course of the film, but there's also a lot of stuff to dig into because they dig a hole for the body, bury the body, exhume the body, and then bury the body again about 3 times, maybe 4.
Yeah, they keep finding excuses. They're like, okay, so no one is really to blame. Let's just bury him and no one will worry. And then they keep finding like reasons like, oh man, we should get the body up. Oh, no, we could just keep it down there. Because they keep revealing more information about, who had a hand, who saw him before he died, and all this kind of stuff. And so it's just the most ridiculous romp that involved a whole town and a dead body.
Yeah, it's fairly well structured. As they dig into the mystery, and I will just keep saying that pun, I don't care. As they dig into the mystery and unravel the plot, which could easily suffice as the entire plot to this film, and it could be a drama. Then they instead constantly dig and redig up this body and add these wonderful comedic beats. And at that point, like, the entire thing is a comedy. Like, everybody's just so deadpan about it. The entire thing matches all of the stories I've ever heard about Hitchcock's sense of humor.
Yeah, exactly. And this is actually one of the things he says about it is that it was his attempt to prove that British humor can sell in America because it's very dry and it's pretty dark. And like, taken at face value, it's pretty dark, but it's just so lighthearted and fun when you're watching it. And it's the ultimate example of a thing that Hitchcock says a lot, which is that dialogue is something that the characters are doing while the action is taking place. In other words, he loves any time that he can contrast the tone of the spoken part of the film and the visual part of the film. And he gives, like, basically his quintessential example of that is that meeting between the captain and Miss Gravely, and this moment where they are literally making a date while trying to cover up this dead body, and she sees it, she knows that it's a dead body, and he explains like, oh no, I accidentally killed him, it's okay, I'm just gonna bury him and no one will have to know. He honestly, the captain reminds me of Hitchcock a lot, in that Hitchcock had this famous fear of cops, and that's like a majority of the motivation of the captain is that he doesn't want to get involved with cops. Wrong man. Yeah. He's afraid. He's trying to prevent being the wrong man, which,
and in doing so, becomes the anti-hero.
Yeah, it becomes basically, if they found out after he buries the body, then he has committed a felony. Then it's even worse for him because he's not the wrong man anymore.
So if being an anti-hero is becoming the protagonist by some means other than nobility, typically selfishness or self-interest, then our captain becomes an anti-hero when he decides to hide the body.
Like, immediately, right off the bat of this movie.
Yeah, when Miss Gravely becomes an anti-hero when she doesn't immediately tell the captain her story. Like, when she walks up to the captain and she decides to hide it, and eventually, of course, all the characters tell their stories, otherwise the movie won't work. And she immediately decides to hide it. That's her anti-hero moment.
And also not telling him to tell the police or telling the police on him.
Yeah. And then, of course, Miss Rogers, when she finds the body, she's totally okay with it. She wanted this guy.
Yeah, she's happy about it.
I don't know if I would say she wanted this guy dead, but she's perfectly okay with it. Yeah. And she's not going to make a fuss about it. I love
one of her lines in the film is, "I don't care what you do with Harry, just as long as you don't bring him back to life." And we're like, okay, got it.
Well, we understand your motivation. And of course, Sam Marlowe, the artist, who is maybe the closest thing to actual hero in the film, because he decides to help his friends when they're in trouble.
Right.
Except even he has very selfish motivations. He's in it to get with the single mom, Miss Rogers. And eventually over the course of the film, like, you know, the romance lines between him and Miss Rogers and the captain and Miss Gravely develop, and they all do become friends. And you know, after this, they'll be really good friends. If there's one way to become really good friends with somebody, you know, have to bury a body with them 3 times.
Yeah,
that'll really do it.
Getting away with murder, almost literally.
yeah. But you know, his motivations are pretty selfish, and even if they were just nobly wanting to help his friends out of a tough situation, he does very bad things to make it happen. And I think that's a pretty good definition of anti-hero too. If you have noble intentions, but you do bad things because of those noble intentions, I think that might make you an anti-hero, or maybe more accurately, like an anti-villain. That's a thing.
Yeah, I think we can roll with that. I think there is one scene though that we should point out specifically, is that there's this contrast between, you know, just the normal character of all of these characters and the fact that they are burying and re-exhuming this body over and over again. And because there's the one scene where the millionaire finally gets in touch with Sam, and he's like, "How much do you want for these paintings? I'll pay whatever you want." And Sam says, "Everybody, tell me what it is that you want. What do you want? And I'll so I'm gonna pay in, you know, a new suit and fishing rod, or a new pair of shoes and all the stuff." So it's like this very selfless moment, while they've been like, they've got dirt on them from literally burying and unburying this body. And what it reminds me a lot of is Arsenic and Old Lace. Like, I'm constantly making connections between these two movies, because our whole thing in Arsenic and Old Lace is following these 2 old ladies who are willfully murdering old men because they think they're doing them a favor. But we're rooting for them the whole time, and it's just this logical break. They have put this logic in their heads that you know, that convinces themselves that murdering these men is good. In the same way that here it's like, okay, it's the best thing to do to hide this body from the police and stuff like that. And I think it's just this interesting fact that so many times comedies rely on anti-heroes in order to get the point across. We just never think of them that way, because there are so many Deadpools and stuff like that out there that look totally different than you know, Josephine Hull in Arsenic and Old Lace.
Right. Although, I mean, Deadpool is wearing a mask most of the time, so.
Okay, that's true. But, you know, it's a different kind of anti-hero. But I think if we're taking anti-hero by its definition, like a lot of comedy films and this kind of screwball comedy, you know, falls in that category, and we just don't think about it because of the way that it's presented. And so it's just an interesting, like, different, when you think about anti-heroes, you're not thinking so much about these really lighthearted movies that make you laugh a lot, because you're not thinking about the fact that you're laughing at people like trying to get away with felonies. You know, it's this presentational.
Yeah, you certainly don't want to tell a comedy about a competent person with good intentions.
Yeah, and there's something else that Hitchcock talks about that I want to touch here, but we're going to talk about Psycho next time. Is this fact that Psycho is made with a certain amount of comedy to it, because it's this very, very dark story, and yet if he were portraying it in the way that it should be, it would be a documentary, and we would be given all the facts, and they would all be laid out, and we would go through all of these things and see what happened in order and all that kind of stuff. And it would just be really depressing But if you put a little bit of this, spin on it, this like in some ways comedic, dark comedic tone to it, it makes it much more interesting and it keeps the audience involved. And that's one of the things that Hitchcock is so good at doing is even in Psycho and some other movies, like another anti-hero movie, Frenzy, is he makes you afraid for the bad guy, for the villain. And Hitchcock is really good at using suspense no matter what the motivations of the character that we're watching are. And The Trouble with Harry is just kind of like an extreme example of that, because we care about them because for the most part, they're all good people, except for this one thing that happens to be a really bad thing that we're watching them do.
Right. And of course, spoilers. Again, I think I'm already said this, but Harry wasn't killed by any of them.
Yeah, he had like a heart attack and died or something.
Yeah. He
was hit on the head twice. Which was might have
contributed to it, I guess. But, in the context of the story, like dying of a heart attack is basically your
natural causes.
Yeah, it works. Also, I find it hilarious that in 1955, Hitchcock was trying to prove that British humor could sell in America because, nowadays, 50, 60 years later, British humor is pretty popular here. It's a pretty common genre of comedy to watch.
I mean, who knows all the lines to Monty Python and the Holy Grail?
Right.
Ton of Americans know all the lines to that movie.
Right.
That is like epitomal British humor.
Incredibly popular over here. And it's nice to think that Hitchcock was one of the first people to try to get it popular over here. And I don't think The Trouble with Harry was ever a huge success in the US, but it was one of Hitchcock's favorite movies.
Yeah, it was actually more popular than expected in France. Truffaut said it was only expected to run for like a couple of weeks, but it ran for like 2 months to packed houses. So that's a really interesting point about the film. And I think that it holds up. Like, I'm surprised that I haven't heard about this or seen it before now, because I think it holds up with Arsenic and Old Lace and Bringing Up Baby and some of these other screwball comedies that we've watched before.
Again, that Truffaut putting words in your ears.
Exactly.
Oh, right. And before I forget, I just want to mention the cameo for The Trouble with Harry real quick. At 22 minutes and 14 seconds, the man walking past the limo of the rich man outside is Alfred Hitchcock, which I didn't notice. I had to look that up.
Yeah, I did not notice that one at all.
Just because, like, it's odd to have a random person walk by in this town in the middle of nowhere where no one is walking by.
Right. All the characters in this town, basically.
Right. There are no extras, except for Alfred Hitchcock. So that's interesting. Anyway, that's the cameo for The Trouble with Harry. Let's move on to our final film of the day, one of Jonathan's favorite films of all times. I like this movie a lot too, but not quite the same way that Jonathan does. So why don't you explain the plot of Vertigo from 1958 for us, Jonathan, and try not to leave our heads spinning.
All right, I will try. And I'm just going to kind of skim through the plot again, because there's so much kind of packed into this movie that we'll have to get into. Again, it's kind of the epitomal Hitchcock film where he takes all of the themes and character developments and stuff that he likes to play with, packs them into one film, and then breaks them and resurrects them all in the space of one movie. And it's on the top of the BFI's 50 best films of all time list for a reason. So spoilers though for this film, if you have not seen it, go watch it and come back in 4, 3, 2. So we start off Vertigo with a police chase, and Jimmy Stewart is running with the other police trying to catch this guy. Something's going on. We don't know. It doesn't matter. Jimmy Stewart misses a jump. They're all jumping over rooftops, and he's left hanging by a gutter, and he looks down and is really far, and we get a classic shot that we'll definitely talk about in a little bit, which is now called the Vertigo shot, basically where it looks like the floor of the ground is moving away from him. And one of the other policemen comes back and tries to help him up. He's like, give me your hand. But he can't. He's terrified, kind of like frozen. And the other policeman who's on this steep roof ends up falling off to his death, which, is obviously a little bit traumatizing. And that's kind of our little prologue. And then we end up with Jimmy Stewart and a girl named Midge in this very yellow apartment room. And he's playing with a cane, balancing it around, and they have a little bit of conversation about him trying to get over his vertigo, which he has after that incident. He stands on a stepladder and stuff like that. We see him faint, so we know that this is a real condition. And then we know that they kind of go back for a long time. They used to be engaged and all that. But he's like, "Do you ever remember this guy from back in the school days?" And she's like, "Oh no, I don't really know." He's like, "Well, he called me up and he needs my help. So I'll go check out, see what he wants, even though I'm retired from detectiving and stuff like that."
Detectiving, my favorite verb.
Anyway, we go to this meeting that Scotty has with an old schoolmate who tells him this really crazy story about how he thinks that his wife is possessed with the spirit of her great-grandmother who ended up committing suicide. And we don't learn all this right away. We kind of unravel it a little bit through the story. And he wants to know what his wife is doing all day because he thinks that she's in danger of committing suicide like her great-grandmother did. And she has these spells where she blacks out and does things that she doesn't remember and stuff like that. And so Jimmy Stewart is reluctant, but he ends up being convinced to follow the wife around. And so he does, and they go to these very specific places. There's a grave site and a specific grave and a museum where she looks at a painting where the woman in the painting has the same hairstyle and flowers and stuff. And she goes to a hotel room and then goes to Golden Gate Bridge. And there are a couple days of him following her around and stuff like that. And, just kind of nothing really interesting happening until they go to the Golden Gate Bridge and she jumps into the water and he fishes her out, brings her back to his apartment, and then they start to have this conversation, and she does not remember any of this. And there's actually a moment that I should have mentioned beforehand where before he agrees to take the job, the guy's like, "Here, just come with us. We're going to have dinner at this place called Ernie's today. And so you can see her there, and then you'll know who you're following and all this kind of stuff." And the shot that Hitchcock uses when Jimmy Stewart first sees her name is Madeline, is just very highlighted. Literally, Hitchcock does this really soft effect, and Ernie's, this bar, is very red. And it's literally, and I've mentioned this before, but it reminds me of a shot in a silent film when we would close up on a character's face and the background would be an entirely solid color and it would be a very soft filter and stuff on it. And it's just really over exaggerated. And Hitchcock brings this into kind of the modern day for this introduction shot. So we're already seeing that it's a little bit of this connection at first sight thing with Jimmy Stewart.
Oh yeah. And there's a lot of forced exaggerated lighting throughout Vertigo. It's very, very avant-garde. There's a lot of
very specific and intentional.
Yeah. It's very conscious storytelling. Anyway.
Yeah. Like I said last week, you can feel the filmmaking in Hitchcock films. He's not going for cinema verite by any stretch of the imagination. So now that these two characters have met and Jimmy Stewart is not telling her that he is following her. He's just like, "Oh no, I was just kind of out and about," and all this kind of stuff. So then they end up meeting again and wandering around the city intentionally together this time. And so after a couple more days of this, there's this moment where Jimmy Stewart is realizing that, she is going to all these places that her great-grandmother did and is very important. And so he's like, "We need to go to all these places and then you'll be free of whatever this thing is in your mind," because he's not convinced that she's possessed. And so they go to this old church and then she kind of has this moment where she kind of snaps. And through this, they've definitely fallen in love and all that kind of stuff. And she runs up to the bell tower after saying something like, "It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I must go. I must." And Jimmy Stewart tries to follow her up the bell tower, but his vertigo prevents him. And then we have the really famous vertigo shot down the stairwell. and all the stairs are kind of stretching and doing this really weird distance effect that we'll go into more specifically later. And so since he cannot make it all the way up, she ends up casting herself down from the roof and dying basically on a lower tier of the roof. And then we have this sequence of, well, first of all, a court scene where they basically prove that Jimmy Stewart didn't do it in this really like condescending court scene.
Yeah,
where
the judge is a real dick.
Yeah, they're like, he should have been more careful after she tried to kill herself the first time, but we can't blame him for his inadequacies and what a terrible person he is. And you're just like, whoa, wait, what? Can you?
I mean, of course,
a little objective.
Of course, the judge has to be a dick in this scene because he has to say all of the shortcomings that Jimmy Stewart's character is feeling in that scene. Because if Jimmy Stewart's character said them, it would feel forced. But having to have Jimmy Stewart's character on public display, and the judge describes his moral collapse in the wake of this tragedy, that's really effective to us as an audience. And plus, like, it makes us sympathize and empathize with Jimmy Stewart, which is good considering what he's about to do.
Right. So after this, though, he has this nightmare in this really fantastical, partially animated dream sequence that, if possible, is even more out there than Salvador Dali's dream sequence from Spellbound. And basically goes into like a little coma, and he goes to he's in, I don't know what it is, like a hospital or a rest home or something, where Midge is trying to help him with Mozart get back to his normal mental state, but he's just kind of like a zombie in a chair in the corner. And then the doctor throws out our favorite little guilt complex term, but it actually makes sense here because, he feels responsible for her death, even though, it's kind of his mental instability that caused it and all that kind of stuff. The psychology is not dwelled upon a lot. It's kind of implied throughout this story, but it is not Spellbound level in your face. And then we kind of start another story, and for a while it feels strange because after he gets better, quote unquote, after this little melancholia spell, he is kind of walking around, going to all the places that him and Madeline went, and basically not doing himself any favors, trying to feel better. And at some point, he sees this woman who looks a lot like Madeline, and he becomes infatuated with her. She looks very different. Madeline had like bleach blonde hair, like almost white, and this woman that he sees on the street is a redhead, and he ends up like stalking her to her room, and then convinces her to go out with him. Kind of has this little sob story kind of thing.
Very aggressive,
but also kind of sympathetic. Because we know like where he's coming from, and she kind of catches on too, until we learn that she is Madeline.
Dun, dun, dun. This is like halfway through the movie too.
Yeah, this is almost exactly halfway through the movie. I think his nightmare is halfway through the movie, and then this is like 15 minutes after that. And so after he leaves this first time, she starts writing this note that we, the audience, get to hear what she was going to write, which is something along the lines of, "I'm so sorry I had to do this to you. This was all his plan. The other guy from the beginning of the movie who hired him and then skipped town after the whole thing happened. So now we know that he was plotting to kill his wife and using Jimmy Stewart as a patsy to get away with it." That's not even important in this movie, honestly. Like, that is a backdrop. Normally Hitchcock would dwell on, what happens to the bad guy and how did all this go down. But it's really just a character study of Jimmy Stewart with that as the background. And so she's like, if I were strong enough, I would stay and try and make you love me for who I am and not who he made me pretend to be. And then by the time she finishes writing it, she decides that she does have the courage to do that. So she crumples it up and decides to go out with Jimmy Stewart and basically go along with whatever it is, pretend that she doesn't know what he's talking about, and try to make him love her for who she is. And then she realizes that as they are hanging out, Jimmy Stewart begins to do things like buy her clothes that look exactly like Madeline's did, and he wants her to change her hair and all this stuff. And she knows that, we know that she knows that he's basically making her into who she was already pretending to be. Again, so many layers going on here. And she's resisting this, and he ends up, basically just through persistence, transforming her back into the facade that she had, until he eventually figures out what happened, figures it out through a piece of jewelry that Madeline had that he did not buy for this new woman whose name is Judy. So then he doesn't let it on, and he carries her back to the bell tower and drags her up, and she meets an unfavorable end, and it's just a very tragic story all around. Again, I already warned you about spoilers, so go watch this movie. But as my very long-winded explanation probably alluded, there's a lot of stuff to unpack, so let's get into it.
Right. And before we get into the meaty stuff, let's talk about the cameo, just to kind of get it out of the way, much like Hitchcock likes to do. Get it out of the way early in the film, and then you don't have to worry about people looking for it later on. Anyway, the cameo comes at 11 minutes and 40 seconds into the film, where Hitchcock is walking down the street with an instrument case. I believe it's a trumpet case specifically, in front of the dockyard where Jimmy Stewart's friend who hires him for this job works. So you can see him there. If you're interested in going and finding it, he will be there.
All right, so about the story itself, let's just start there, because we already mentioned about the adaptations and things that Hitchcock changed, which this one has a very specific instance, and that is the fact that apparently in the book, you don't learn that Judy and Madeline are the same woman until the very end. And Hitchcock decided to give it away in the middle, as we already pointed out. And basically everyone decision. Yeah, and basically everyone around him was like, "What are you doing? You just gave it away. What is there to look forward to?" And he's like, "Well, okay. So this is Hitchcock's rationale, is that basically he puts it in this context of a child listening to a story from his mother and asking the question, what happens next? What's going to happen next?" And he felt that in the book, if you don't know that she is the same woman, there's really not a lot of what happens next. It just kind of feels like another story. Like, okay, he's falling in love with another woman, trying to turn her into someone that she's not, and she's resisting just for whatever reason. Like, she could make her hair white. Like, what does it matter to her? But knowing that this is an identity that she's trying to run away from, and that's not really her, but that she had occupied for a while, raises the stakes so much more. And then it's like, okay, what happens next? What is she gonna do, knowing what he's doing, and what is he gonna do, not knowing that she is the same person that he's trying to turn her into? And so it just, again, going back to like North by Northwest and the way that Hitchcock reveals information to the audience, he's so good at just like giving us enough to keep us going, to keep us wondering what's happening next, and not just like give us this shocking moment at the end, but he takes that one shocking moment at the end of the book where you're like, oh my gosh, it was the same woman. And then you go on with your day, and he puts it in the middle, and you're like, oh my gosh, is the same woman? How is that going to work? And then he drags it out for another hour, because again, it's right in the middle of the movie. And it's just so perfectly placed and timed.
Right. And you have to, especially when you're talking about suspense, you have to take into consideration where the audience is in relation to your characters. And in this case, specifically the protagonist. So are they on the same page as the characters? Are they ahead of the characters? Or are they behind the characters? And when they are ahead of the characters, you have a storytelling term called dramatic irony, where the audience knows something that the character doesn't. Hitchcock is very good at that. It's a great way to create suspense. It's the difference between seeing a conversation between two characters where we see there's a bomb under the table, and we see that neither of the characters know that the bomb is under the table and ticking.
Right.
Then there's a lot of suspense in that scene versus just a scene where two people are talking at a table and then suddenly the table explodes. Like, yeah, that's shocking. That's a twist. But
for like a couple seconds.
But for like a couple seconds. Whereas like if you show it beforehand, you get so much more out of that scene. It's so wonderful.
And then it does this thing like we talked about with The Trouble with Harry, where the way that Hitchcock always gives that, the bomb under the table example is if you're just having this conversation about baseball or something, and then it's really boring until the table explodes. But if we know that the table is going to explode, then we're like, why are you talking about baseball? You are about to die. Right. And so it turns this like completely meaningless thing into something different because the visual aspect or the, what the audience knows about the scene is different than what the characters are talking about in the scene. And that keeps us going.
Yeah, exactly. And it's you essentially plant this bomb underneath Jimmy Stewart.
A big one.
halfway through the film, and you wonder, you just wonder what's going to happen when he explodes. What's going to happen when that bomb goes off in his face? And you do get to see that at the end. But before we jump into the ending, because the actual ending of the book, besides the moving of the twist from the end to the middle, is slightly different. How Jimmy Stewart reacts to the information. I do want to just kind of make a larger point about twist endings, because people seem to really love twist endings. They seem to really love shocks because they really shock them. They really surprise them, right? But I don't know. I don't think a cheap or a twist ending measures up to a suspenseful film to the same extent.
And it definitely depends. Like, there are ways to do the twist ending, but it's a give and take. It's kind of like an opportunity cost. Like, is the twist ending good enough to land the film? Like, is landing the film right there better than drawing out the suspense? Like, if we can take that ending and maybe give up a twist at the end, but add an hour of suspense, it's a give and take.
Yeah, because that suspense is what's going to sit with you. It's not going to be the anecdote you tell your friends, but it's what's going to sit with you and make you want to go watch a movie again. And I think that's part of what makes Vertigo so popular. But yeah, ever since The Sixth Sense came out, everybody's wants to put a twist ending in whatever they make, and half the time it's just kind of feels like you're cheating the audience, or it can turn into a whole mess. It can turn into a whole mess, and it can subvert the suspense you were trying to build in your film and the tension you were trying to build in your film. And we talked about either last time or the time beforehand how a good film, and especially suspense film, and you could really argue that any film is a suspense film in the same way that any film is a mystery film, works on this principle of building tension and then releasing it, and then building tension and then releasing it. And a good twist ending is the release, but a good suspense build is the build up to it. And the thing that makes the release so fun is a good suspense build up. And if you sacrifice that build up in exchange for a really good twist ending, then or a really shocking twist ending, then maybe you lose something in the exchange. Anyway, that's my mini rant. And it can be done.
You've got The Sixth Sense, which the twist ending makes the rewatch more enjoyable in a different way. So that actually gives another value to the movie after that first watch. And then there are other instances of an ending that almost increases the suspense of the movie. So if you take like Inception, people are going to be debating the end of Inception forever, basically, because Nolan gives you that suspense and never relieves it, even at the end of the film. So it's almost more suspenseful once you've left with that. I mean, it's almost like a pseudo twist. It's not even a full twist because we don't know. And so that's an interesting, excuse the pun, twist on this idea of a twist ending. So again, there are ways to do it, but it's not like something that you should be dying to put at the end of your movie, because sometimes it can be better served elsewhere.
Right. All right, so let's talk about the slight change in the ending of Vertigo. And quick spoiler warning, you guys are going to not like it if you don't want spoilers. So go watch a movie real quick. Okay, you good? Okay, welcome back. So originally, at the end of the movie, when the twist happened, or end of the book, where the twist happens, and Jimmy Stewart's character finds out that Judy is Madeline and Madeline is Judy, he goes crazy and kills Madeline. He strangles her in the book, and that is changed in the movie slightly, so that Judy isn't killed by Scotty, but she does still die. She is shocked right out that window.
Not outright. And it's really a great moment, because
by
since
a
we're
nun.
Doing spoilers, there's a moment where they're at the top of the bell tower, and he's like, I made it. And she's like, now you can love me. You know the truth. I'm sorry I hid it from you. He's like, no, it's too late. And then this is a night scene. This is a very dark scene. And this nun comes up the stairs, and in such Hitchcockian fashion, she's completely silhouetted and basically looks like the Grim Reaper, literally. And she walks forward, and Judy is so startled that she falls out the window. And then the nun comes forward, and you're like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. No, I've always actually debated what was going on in that last scene to myself. I've never 100% figured it out. I think I'm trying to put symbols into things that aren't supposed to have symbols on them, and trying to say that nun represents such and such when it's just a nun scaring a woman out the window. Where
I think it's like at least the contrast of her coming up and looking like the Grim Reaper, like an angel of death, and then she's, a nun who's supposed to be this bringer of hope and stuff like that. So Hitchcock is just kind of playing and reversing stereotypes.
Yeah, and at the very end, we can say that at least Scotty's gotten over his hangups. Although who the heck knows what kind of hangups he has after this?
I know, right? Twice.
Yeah, he's gotten over his
actually 3 times. Man, that guy is gonna be so messed up.
Well, he got over his Vertigo hang up at the end of the movie. He got over his Madeline hang up by the end of the movie.
Hopefully.
And then was he gonna have like a Judy hang up now?
Yeah, he's gonna make some other woman have red hair and wear green instead of gray.
Yeah, just for a little while, and then he's going to transform them into Madeline.
Right.
It's going to get deeper and deeper every time.
Speaking of Inception,
and they all go by defenestration.
Exactly. So what we got to talk about though is our antihero, which is Jimmy Stewart, because that's what this podcast is about. And the interesting thing, so this is your epitomal antihero, basically. We're in a neo-noir film. We've got someone making very unheroic choices. But the interesting thing is that this isn't like a cop story or something where we start off with a character who is kind of morally ambiguous. Like, we start off with the everyman. We start off with Jimmy Stewart being very sympathetic and likable. We understand him. He is George Bailey pretty much at the beginning of this movie. And then we just watch him just decline by degrees into this obsession and basically what Hitchcock even describes as like this necrophilia, this obsession with a loved dead one and wanting to bring her back to life and love her again. And it's just, maddening to watch because it's so slow. Hitchcock takes 2 hours and just brings us into this pit of obsession. And it's just like, again, the epitomal way of taking your character and just driving him farther and farther down this road, and he keeps making these decisions that are detrimental to himself and to Judy, and we're not even following the real bad guy, which is that guy who hired him. He just kind of
goes off into the wind.
he sets up Jimmy Stewart, he just pushes over the little snowball at the top of the hill and isn't even there by the time it gets to the bottom.
Yeah. The censorship board did not like that. They wanted a scene towards the end where Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak were listening to a radio about that guy being almost caught by the police and they're hot on his trail, which would not have worked.
It would have felt very forced.
It would have felt incredibly forced. But, this is already 1958. The censorship board was starting to lose its power. And Hitchcock was Hitchcock, and he just went ahead and did not do it. And as we now know, Vertigo is one of the films that he retained the rights to afterwards. So he kind of got away with doing his thing, and thank gosh he did.
Yeah, and this is a film that he always had a liking for personally, even though, like I said, it did not do very well in the box office when it was released. But
I can imagine 1950s American audiences being very confused by this.
Yeah, but it's something that if you kind of take a step back and look at it almost at a meta level, there is this almost connection that you can make between the way that Scotty obsessively turns Judy into this image of what he wants her to be, and the way that Judy allows herself by degrees to be transformed in order to get his love no matter what. At first she wants him to love her for who she is, but eventually she's just like, what do I have to do to make you love me? And if it's becoming someone else, then fine, I'll do it. And if you look at that in relationship to a director and the actors, there's kind of a similar thing, like we talked about with the way that Hitchcock would, take an actress and mold her into who he wanted her to be. And even specifically to this film, Kim Novak is not the actress that Alfred Hitchcock wanted to play this role, and he was not very satisfied with her performance afterwards. He thought it was kind of bland, even though pretty much everyone who watches this film is like, what are you talking about? She's perfect. Like, she has all the right qualities needed for this. But even Kim Novak has said in interviews afterwards that she identifies with Judy and this thing where she was a fresh actress to Hollywood, and, at this point, Hitchcock is literally at the peak of his career, and she was willing to do whatever in order to be accepted by him, the great Alfred Hitchcock, and he molded her into this idea of, the female character that he wanted, which is something that we could talk about now, which is all of the female roles that go into this, because it's so interesting to watch. So the things that we've already set up, if you didn't hear last week, especially in terms of women, is, we typically have our blonde-haired love interest, our darker-haired kind of rival character who rivals the blonde love interest for the attention of the main character, and a mother. And though we don't really have a mother in this film, some of the women kind of act motherly towards Jimmy Stewart. But what we do have is Midge, who's a blonde, kind of traditional Hitchcockian blonde at the beginning. And we know that they used to be engaged, and she's set up as a love interest from the very beginning, and that continues. And then we meet Madeline, who, as I said, is bleach blonde, almost white hair, which makes Midge, the blonde, the darker haired rival to Madeline, whom Jimmy Stewart ends up actually falling in love with, which is really interesting. And then the fact that Madeline dies and Judy comes along, and Judy is a redhead, so now she is our darker haired character, and Judy wants Jimmy Stewart's love, but Judy is Madeline, so Judy becomes the darker haired rival to herself, because Jimmy Stewart is in love with a different version of herself. And it's just like, again, so many things that Hitchcock is doing here and taking his own tropes that he made. Like this thing with the women and the different colored hair, like, is not a thing in anyone else's movies except Hitchcock's. And he's taking his own thing and breaking it and then doing it again in the same way that, Madeline is coming along and dying and then being remade again. And it's just like, there's so much stuff going on here.
Yeah. So when I talked about in the intro to this episode, this being maybe the best crafted of the Hitchcock films, the most intricately put together. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about, where this is a guy at the top of his craft who's been doing this for a while, who has the experience, who has the power in the industry to get stuff done, and he just does it all in this movie. And wow, is it complicated? Even trying to suss out the morality as stuff goes downhill in the that's actually a small pun because Hitchcock made a movie called Downhill. Anyway,
and the fact that Vertigo would not make you very happy if you're going downhill.
No, it would not. Anyway, as the characters decline morally over the back half of the film into these like emotional messes, you understand that what's going on is wrong and that what that they are doing is wrong. But at the same time, like, you can find these weird little justifications for it as you're going through.
And the fact that, again, we're setting up Jimmy Stewart as the everyman. So we identify him with at the beginning. We identify with him, and then
we spend half the film building empathy for him.
And then we're trying to just keep that connection in any way that we can by the end, and it gets harder and harder and harder.
Yeah, we're already pretty committed to liking him, and then suddenly he starts doing all these awful things. And it's
Jimmy Stewart, which I think Hitchcock uses to his advantage here,
sure.
Because Jimmy Stewart is one of those people that when you put him on screen, we're going to like him just because because of the brand that Jimmy Stewart is.
Right. And he's doing all these awful things, and you want to say all these things are awful because they are awful, because he believes that this is a different girl, but it isn't a different girl, and she is essentially greenlighting all these decisions eventually, a lot of times after a lot of pressure.
Because she knows what's going on.
But she knows what's going on, and she's willingly going along with this at the same time. So is what he's doing wrong? Yes, no, maybe.
And there's another element at the beginning of Jimmy Stewart just falling in love with her, knowing that she is this other man's wife, but then she isn't this other man's wife because she's a hired actress portraying this other man's wife. So, there's, again, like you're saying with the morality, like everything has these layers that it's so hard to just get through, and is why critics have been just like, when it came out, everyone was like, what the heck did I just watch? But as critics have been just thinking through this movie, they're like, oh my gosh, how much did he pack into this?
Yeah. No, it is a twisted up mess that is fascinating to watch. And, it's not one of these, and a lot of Hitchcock's films are like this. It's one of these films that it's not a message film. There's no like message to take home from it.
It's a character analysis,
an incredibly well told story, and
in kind of the same way that Lawrence of Arabia is, where you just kind of follow Lawrence down this rabbit hole of identity crisis. It's kind of like that. It's just one of these films that you're going on this journey of seeing what happens to this character. There's no Aesop's fables like, and that's why you shouldn't be friends with a bad person.
Yeah. And that's one of those things that is just pounded into you in film school these days, is that especially in writing classes in film school, before you write, what are you trying to say? What is your theme? What is your message? What are you trying to say to the audience?
Well, that's not to say like there is a theme, like there is.
Oh yeah. Theme and message are different things. You're right.
Yeah. So it's an incredibly thematic film, even if it doesn't tell you, what to take away from it. Like you do come away with, it's basically a what not to do kind of movie.
Yeah, even if it doesn't tell you what to do, it tells you what not to do. If you find yourself in any of these following situations, stop,
do not
turn around.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about some of the technical stuff in this film. I think we
haven't even got to color. Oh my gosh!
I think I've already mentioned that some of the lighting is forced in a way. You mentioned when he first sees Madeline in the restaurant, the line gets really bright. There's a moment where they're in the shop listening to the history of San Francisco and this woman Carlotta, who Madeline is related to, and her story. And the lighting gets pretty dark during that.
The sun goes down during that scene.
Yeah,
right? And then whether in real life or through the lighting, but yeah, that always stands out to me.
Yeah, that one's pretty crazy. There's, I think one of the
blur
best
filters
examples
at the cemetery.
Yeah, one of the best examples. Yeah, there's a lot of diffusion. There's a lot of blur in this film. The Judy's same person, whatever. Judy's apartment in the hotel is, first of all, beautifully lit by this green neon sign that's right outside. And real quick, before I get into this, Jonathan, did you know that hotel is still around? It's named the Hotel Vertigo. And
what? They changed the name?
Yeah. And fairly recently, they changed the name in like 2009.
That's insane.
And that Madeline's room is, while still maintained, almost the exact same as it was.
That's amazing.
Anyway, there's beautiful light in the room. The green neon sign outside gives this wonderful, wonderful, unique wash that reminds me of a slightly bluer version of the greens we saw in To Catch a Thief. But there's this wonderful scene where Judy emerges fully transformed into Madeline from her closet after fixing her hair the complete correct way that Jimmy Stewart remembered it on Madeline. And as she steps out, she's like in this beam of ultralight that is on top of her, on top of like this blur filter. It's like she's like this glowing celestial being stepping out of this closet. It is just bonkers to see it. It's not diegetic in the least, not motivated at all, other than by what Jimmy Stewart's character is feeling in that moment when he sees her. And that's enough, because we've already seen so many crazy things in this movie, including the nightmare scene, which is nuts.
Right.
So we buy it. As long as the movie is consistent with itself, it's okay.
Yeah, and I mean, just aside from like just the starkness of the colors, all the colors have a meaning. So one of the things about this movie is that this is neo-noir. Probably not the first neo-noir, but maybe the epitomal neo-noir. And we've talked about this before, like with Old Boy specifically. We talked a lot about the colors and how purple is very specifically used and all these different colors. And basically every character in this movie has a color associated with them. So the bad guy is associated with red. His office is all red. And when we go to Ernie's at the beginning, it's all red. And Madeline's color is green and gray. When we see her in the at Ernie's, she's wearing a green shawl, and that's like the opposite color of red. So that stands out, first of all, right away. And then, like you said, when we meet Judy, when we meet her for the first time, she's wearing all green, and her apartment is flooded with this green light at all times. And green is often associated with like a death and like a sickly color, and that goes into these themes again, which Hitchcock himself has talked about, of like this necrophilia kind of an aspect, which is really interesting that it like he's bringing that in like at the beginning. Her car is green at the beginning of the film. So once Scotty kind of gets sucked into this whole story, his color starts to become red too. And there's this great moment when he fishes Madeline out of the bay, and they're sitting in his living room, and she's wearing his red robe and he's wearing a green sweater, and they've switched colors because they're connecting now. And Midge's color the whole time is yellow because her apartment is very yellow. Although every time we go to her apartment, it is a darker time in the day until the very last time that, not the last time that we see her. But one of the last times that we see her, she's wearing a red shirt because she is trying to win Johnny's affections. Johnny, Scotty, Jimmy Stewart's character has like several names that are not related. But she's basically painted herself like this painting that we talked about before, trying to transform herself into what Scotty wants, which is what Scotty ends up doing to Judy, but he doesn't accept it from Midge, and she's wearing red at that moment, which is, again, trying to connect with him. And then whenever he goes into this melancholia spell, he's in the hospital and everything is blue. He's wearing a blue sweater. There's blue around, and Midge is there, and she has these pink flowers that just like pop in that room. But all of these colors are being so specifically used and switched and placed in every scene, just to really like complete everything. Like, again, this is one of the things I talk about with neo-noir films is if you turn the sound off, you can follow the story just by watching the colors. And that's one of the great things about color film, because I love black and white a lot, especially for noir films. But the way to use color in noir films is like this: colors that carry the theme in every single scene. And it's just like perfectly done in Vertigo.
Right. I mean, there's plenty of movies out there, even really good movies that just shoot in color stock because that's what they have. That's like the standard of the day. But nothing's ever really done with color outside of nothing that screams director involvement or cross-departmental collaboration. Right. Like nothing that was done on purpose, just stuff that was done for the sake of design in one single scene. But
one of the modern directors who does this really well is Wes Anderson, and Alex can probably speak to that more than I can. But
yes.
Just because of Wes Anderson's specific mise en scène in all of his movies, color plays into that, and I'm sure that is something that he pulled a lot from Hitchcock and specifically Vertigo because of just how well it's used here.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of Vertigo in a lot of his movies. There's a lot of shockingly enough, there's a lot of Torn Curtain in one of his movies. There's like a scene straight from Torn Curtain in the Grand Budapest Hotel. And all of Wes Anderson's films are actually like color coded. Like the Grand Budapest is pink. The Fantastic Mr. Fox is orange, and The Life Aquatic is blue. The Darjeeling Limited is yellow. The Royal Tenenbaums is red. I could go all day. Anyway, but yeah. I also love color. Like I said before, like this is what I do. This is my job. I am a colorist. And color can be used quite significantly to denote things. And we should mention that while we talk about it, it sounds like these characters are choosing these clothes consciously and on purpose. But that's not really what we're saying or what the story is trying to say. You shouldn't really be in theory, you shouldn't be noticing the color during the watching of the movie. You shouldn't,
especially the first watch.
Yeah, especially on the first watch. You shouldn't be like, wow, all of the bad guys were dressed in red. It should be this subtle thing that connects everything else that you see over the course of the film. Because that's the art, that's part of the art of visual storytelling. You can get so much information into somebody's eye in just one frame.
Yeah, it's a subconscious clue
that you cue these things in, so that they're connected, and the next time you see such and such a color or such and such a symbol or such and such a person, you associate all those other things that you've seen with them. It's almost the same concept of like if you chew cinnamon gum while you study, and then you chew cinnamon gum while you take the test, you'll do better on the test. Except much, much more fun.
Right. And another thing, just like as long as we're talking about like the mise en scène and the colors and stuff, is just like the way that these sets are built. Because again, all of these sets are like, Hollywood sets. Everything is built and populated. And one of the things that Hitchcock talks about a lot is this fact that he doesn't like art designers very much, because he feels like they just kind of come in, they put a bunch of stuff in the room that they think looks good, and then their job is done. But he's really interested in making sure every room feels like the characters live there. So, for example, in The Birds, for the school teachers' little house/inn thing, he had a photographer basically go to the school teacher's house in Bodega Bay, where the story takes place, and a school teacher's house in San Francisco, because that's where the school teacher is from, and mix them. And so it was the combination of those two things, like actual people's how like living spaces. And the same thing with Vertigo, where he would go to an actual San Francisco detective's apartment and then kind of model Scotty's apartment after that. And even he would do this with characters and stuff. So, for example, in a film that we're not talking about, but the remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much, for a pretty small character, honestly, this ambassador character, they kept sending. The casting agency would send him all these people. They all had like little mustaches and facial hair and stuff. And he would ask like, so what have you done? And like, oh, well, I played Count so-and-so. I played like all these government characters, basically like character actors. And because, that was the look of an official. And then he was like, just give me like a bunch of photos of actual ambassadors, and none of them had facial hair. And so he was like, okay, let's go with someone who looks like one of these like actual ambassador people. So there are a lot of these times when he would be very specific, even just in the logistics of what he's putting on the screen, which is just a little thing to throw in there. But I think it's interesting that, just going along with how intentional Hitchcock is about every single thing that is in his frames.
It's an interesting appeal to realism from a man who's not associated with realism.
And
I think that, I think that's a great point.
He goes off on critics that he calls the quote plausibles all the time, because these people who are like trying to poke holes in, plots and stuff like that. And it's funny because Truffaut in his introduction to the book says that as much as Hitchcock kind of dismissed people who were too literal and logistic about his films, like there's very little in his films that is actually implausible because he was so specific about all those things.
Yeah, you just have to make sense within the realm of your own film and you're good. And we talked about that with Spellbound last week. Like none of the psychology stuff makes sense to us.
It doesn't need to.
It doesn't need to. It's good. And I'm sure he did research. It sounds like mid-century stuff, from other movies I've heard. But even that I can't be an authority on. So I'm willing to let it work. But yeah, no, that's a great point, that even movies that take a more fantastical artistic approach are so rooted in real details that ground the
flesh the world out.
Right, because you can only take that grounding thing is important, because you can only take the audience so far into fantasy before you lose them completely. You need something for them to jump off from, something for them to hold on to, and then go to the fantastical, to the crazy, to the Jimmy Stewart's head floating in a vortex.
Right. In a scene that I feel like had not a little bit of influence on 2001's little space vortex.
I'm really wondering what Jimmy Stewart thought of shooting that scene. Because
basically just like flew a fan in his face so his hair would go crazy, and then they cut his head off in post.
Right, like everybody. So I mean, nowadays that's not a shocking scene to film, whether you're using it for vortex tunnel or a disembodied head or whatever. But in the 1950s, that wasn't like standard fare. It wasn't like everybody was doing that. That was pretty unique. So at Jimmy Stewart, after having spent a couple decades in Hollywood doing, westerns and noirs and dramas and comedies and nothing with a floating head in it, I wonder what he thought of suddenly having to do a floating head scene.
But stuff with invisible rabbits. So maybe that's the gateway. Invisible rabbits to floating heads.
Oh, gosh. That movie that Harvey really skated by on, like, almost no VFX, which was pretty great.
Yeah, just a couple like door openings and stuff like that. Anyway, let's move on to our overall notes. Let's start by just talking about, like, I think one of the points that we wanted to make this week is, where you can find anti-heroes, and they're not always just like the really dark and gritty kind of villainous protagonists. Sometimes they're just good people in a comedy film that are making bad decisions for comedic effect. And it's just something interesting that I hadn't really thought about until we were picking out movies. And I was like, you know what? a lot of these screwball comedy characters are making, legally and morally wrong decisions, but we go along with it because it's hilarious how they keep bungling it up.
Yeah, so antiheroes are very popular these days, but it can be hard as somebody who's looking to write one, how to make an antihero engaging or interesting, or how to make them likable, except characters don't really have to be likable. That's just one trait they can possibly have. For instance, in Vertigo, it's certainly a trait that Scotty has at the start of the film. He's quite likable and charming and jovial, and by the end of the film, I don't think he's likable anymore.
No.
He's tortured and crazy and obsessed and near maniacal. But the thing that keeps us involved with Scotty over the course of the film is that he's deeply empathetic. We can understand and relate to how he's feeling over the course of the film, because he's a well-written character. Two, we've seen him go through all the shit that he's had to go through and suffer for it. And I think I made an earlier point about this. The reason why he didn't just say it himself and explain all the trauma that happened to him in the wake of the first Madeline's death, and the reason they had to have him in front of this room full of his peers with a judge criticizing him very harshly for all the things that he's done wrong, and him sitting there and feel bad, is to make him empathetic. And to make him understandable, so we understand why he's doing what he's doing. Or at least
sympathetic if you've never been criticized by a judge before.
Right. At least sympathetic. And that sympathy, empathy, whatever, that relatability, understandability is what makes an anti-hero engaging. And it's what lets you stick with them over the course of a film or a TV show. As I mentioned earlier, so many TV shows are anti-hero based these days. Or like Jonathan was talking about, they can be sympathetic and jovial. They can be animated and fun to watch, because anti-heroes are fundamentally interesting because they're flawed, complicated characters that aren't bland. They're easier to understand, maybe because we're all humans and we're all flawed deeply in multiple ways, so we relate very well to other flawed beings, although I hope none of you are this flawed. Maybe you are.
Right. And again, it's kind of a cautionary tale, but we stick with it because if we picked up with if we made Madeline's death in the middle of the film our prologue, like the little cop dying scene at the beginning, if we made that the beginning and then we just watched Jimmy Stewart destroy Judy's life, we would have zero sympathy for him. And so the fact that it's a slow burn, Hitchcock takes us from someone that we like and we identify with, and then he takes us down one rung of, okay, he fell in love with a married woman. And he takes us down another rung of, okay, he kind of caused her death because he was trying to be with her too much. And then we take him down another rung where it's like, okay, he falls in love with this other woman. He's trying to, so he's just like slowly like taking us down. But if he just like, if we just jumped there, we would just tune out.
Right. And a lot of, if you think about a lot of anti-hero narratives, it's about kind of like this slow downhill crawl of an anti-hero, or vice versa, them seemingly trying to work their way back. But to think of the downhill examples, a good modern example would be Nightcrawler.
And some of these are interesting in that they don't start off as, they don't put us solidly on the protagonist's side like we are with Scotty. Because in Nightcrawler, he's the same person throughout. He's the same terrible person throughout. And we're just having to basically get these little glimpses to make us understand why he's doing what he's doing, even if we never approve of it, because he has
You're
a pretty
so curious
flat
that you want
character.
to see what happens next.
Right, exactly. He's a pretty flat character, but it's the fact that we understand all of his motivations, even if we don't approve of the result of those. There's a great lessons from the screenplay video essay that I'll include in the description that talks through like how that works. And then, there's others like I already mentioned Deadpool and Logan. And as you said, in TV shows, you have Breaking Bad and The Sopranos. And so there are just these tons of examples, and there's different ways of connecting with your character who's going to distance themselves from any normal person throughout the course of the film. And you either have to start off by like giving us little things in order to identify, or start off and making them completely identifiable and then take us down this path. So it's really, or in the case of one of these more comedic instances, you start off with them being very identifiable, and then just don't let anything get too serious in order to take them out of that, because they could do as many bad things as possible. But if you keep like a really light tone, and you keep that contrast between what they're talking about, the way they're handling it, and what they're actually doing, if you keep that contrast far enough apart, then we won't really care all the way through. So that's another thing to keep in mind.
And of course, you have to remember that the people we're talking about now are anti-heroes. They are not setting out to cause...
They're not antagonists.
Yeah, they're not antagonists. They're not setting out to cause evil in the world. They are not setting out to purposefully do harm for the sake of doing harm. If they do bad, or if they do harm to people, it tends to be out of self-interest, and we see that very commonly. Like Scotty in Vertigo, or Deadpool in Deadpool. That the bad things they do are out of selfish motivations or other motivations, but not necessarily evil for the sake of evil or for the sake of being psychotic. That tends to be reserved for villains. And of course, we mentioned there's a whole nother category of anti-villains, but we're not touching that with a 10-foot pole during this series. We are talking about Hitchcock villains, which means talking about psychopaths, or at least sociopaths, murderers, one of the two, and typically murderers. And oddly enough, 2 of our films for next week involve tennis players, which I find fascinating. But Jonathan, what are our 3 films for next week?
Next week, we have 1951's Strangers on a Train, where we'll be swapping some murders, or trying to. We have 1954's Dial M for Murder, and 1960, the ultimate Hitchcock villain, Psycho, with Norman Bates. And we get back into some female character dynamics and lots of fun stuff.
Twists in the middle of the film.
Right, exactly.
And birds.
So that one actually, the Psycho twist blew my mind the first time I saw it. And I didn't see this movie till college.
I was very confused by it too. I don't care what you hear about this film. Like you get. You're not ready for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this should be fascinating. Fun fact before we go, Jonathan, did you know that Dial M for Murder was shot in 3D?
Yes, I did. 3D.
Now the rest of you know. It is not required watching to watch it in 3D. In fact, I don't recommend that you watch it in 3D.
But we do recommend 3D headphones when you listen to us next time.
Yes, hear us in 3 dimensions. That's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us, or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
This week's episode sponsored by the word detectiving. Detectiving. To detectivate. I detectivate. You detectivate. He, she, it detectivates.
This is the Grammarlings now. The fake Grammarlings.
Oh gosh, I hope not. That's like my worst possible subject.